I was raised by my mother. I have a brother older and a sister younger. My mother was extremely poor. We grew up in a very poor neighborhood, horrible neighborhood. And we lived in a horrible building. I mean, all the stuff. We lived in a ghetto. And my mother told me early in my life, and my brother and my sister as well, that where we were was not who we were. She couldn't change the circumstances. She couldn't change where we were living. But she could invest a disproportionate amount of her energy and her resources towards our education, towards my education and my brother's and my sister's education. So she did. My mother made $4,400 a year, her highest pay ever. And my education when I was in high school was $65 a month, $650 a year it took to educate me alone. And so if you multiply that by 3, my mother, half of her salary was, forget about rent and forget about food, it was all on our education. And at that time, this is in the early 70s, late 60s. It's amazing how much that ages me. You could do 3 things if you were a woman. Or there were 3 things that were really sold to you to do. One, especially if you go to a Catholic school. One was to be a nurse. The second was to be a teacher. And the third was to be a nun. Neither of these 3 things actually fit my personality at all. So I actually went to a book in the library called the Baron's Book. I remember looking at the section of the book that's what's the career that you can get after 4 years of college, because college was a requirement in my house. And it's interesting, nowadays I would say, well, how are you going to pay for that? But back then, we never even talked about it. My mother had no money to pay for college. But her assumption was that if we got into college, we would figure it out, right? So you had to go to college. So what career could you get after 4 years of college that paid the most money? This was the deal, because we didn't have any money. And it was being a chemical engineer. When I was a senior in college, I got hooked up into a program that's called GEM, that I summer interned at Xerox, and GEM paid for my graduate school at Columbia, and the rest, as I say, is history. So I started working, an engineer in a lab, worked in the lab for years, 5 years. I remember I would walk into the door, walk down this long hall in the research building in upstate New York, and I would go into the lab, and I had a technician who worked for me. His name was Dick Shell. He was great guy. And I was the engineer, and he was the tech. We would design experiments and run them. And I would leave and go home, walk down the long hall, and then get in my car and drive home. And one day I was walking in after about 2 or 3 years, and a guy stopped me in the hall and said, you know, you've been here for a long time. Don't you think you'd be interested in understanding what we really do as a company? It was a guy who was working in HR at the time. And I said, yeah, I think I know what we do. You know, we do experiments. And he said, no, there's like customers and businesses and pricing, and there's a whole bunch of people all over the United States, all over the world who work for this company, and basically you know one. His name is Dick Shell, so it's probably important that you expand. Paul Allaire, who was the chairman and CEO at the time, called me into his office, and I had an inkling that he wanted me to be his executive assistant. But I was done with this. I figured I did that job, and now I had to get back to my real work, which was running an engineering team or doing some business thing or something or the other. I would have never thought that this would be useful at all, as useful as it was, or as pivotal and impactful as it was. It taught me that there was a lot more to business than just engineering or even pricing and forecasting, right? There was all this political stuff that CEOs or business leaders are involved in. That the level of stress is a lot different than I thought, significantly higher. That the level of control is a lot different than I thought, significantly lower. So there's all these things I had assumed that, yeah, when you become the CEO, all these people do what you say, and it turns out not at all, right? There's a lot of people who do what they say, and you just try to corral them into a reasonable area. Anyway, it was a great, great job, and it taught me, because of Paul's personality, I had worked for a lot of other men who had a really hard-driving, very aggressive approach to business, very aggressive, kind of like a military approach to business. Paul was exactly the opposite. He liked the ballet, and he would leave work early sometimes and go to the ballet with his wife. And it taught me that you could actually mix your life into this thing, and it gave me hope. It was probably the first time that I said, yeah, I could probably do this type of work, leading a company. So I worked for him for a couple of years, and we went through a big organizational redesign, and I was placed on that team. The top 20 people in the company were on this team, and me. I'm vice president of nothing. And I was placed on the team as an equal, and I was honored with my service of being on this team, given the fax business unit. Literally, from engineer to learning a little bit about business to becoming executive assistant to now being the vice president and general manager of Office Color, of which we had no products, and Fax, which we had $300 million worth of revenue, losing $30 million a year. And I remember I felt like I had arrived in the world and developing this unbelievably detailed business plan because I had learned about pricing and forecasting and all this stuff, and I had to go in front of the operations committee and present the business plan for this business. And Paul was quiet, and he said, break even or close it down. And Ann called right after she became the CEO and said, here's your mission. If you choose to take it, here's your mission. We need to save a couple of $1 billion in your portion of the business. It was a great way for me to learn the next step of my development, which was how do you integrate more than one thing? How do you integrate the near term and the long term? And how do you keep superiors informed about really important things that they wouldn't know how to ask you about? They don't know, what to ask you. You're going to outsource manufacturing. They don't know the questions to ask. But they need to know the key points, the key risk areas. One of the things that we are falling behind in the United States, by the way, I would say in the UK as well, I know, is our ability to produce scientists, technicians, engineers, and mathematicians. These people solve problems. They create wealth. They make business. We are moving away from, we years ago started moving away from this as a laudable, proud area. I became an engineer by accident. Why isn't there a way why don't we prime kids to be ready for this earlier? And I spend a lot of time on that with the president, and it's a critical issue, a critical area.